Hello, everybody, and welcome back to part 2 of the Maryland Listing Disclosures Training. I am Tim Brooks with the Brooks Group and the Ultimate Selling Team at Keller Williams Realty. This is going to be a particularly exciting and interesting session where we're going to go over the consent for dual agency, which is one of everyone's favorites, inclusions, exclusions, electronic signatures, buyer's rights and seller's obligations, property condition disclosure or disclaimer, and finally, county and local disclosures. So I am super pumped up and excited about this session. I hope that you are too. Now, before we get started, I just wanted to explain why these disclosures are in the specific order that they are, and that includes 1 through 6 from the previous video. Those stay in that order, and then 7 through 12 are going to be in this order also. The reason being is 7 through 12, these are disclosures that we're actually going to upload and give to the buyer's agent to present to their buyers, and when they're crafting their offer, they're going to include these disclosures as a part of that offer and a part of that file. So when you come back to the office after your listing appointment and you scan in all of your paperwork, this allows you to just make one simple split in the middle of that PDF file, and it makes it much easier just for file management. Now, often I find that agents can become very confused about dual agency, what it is, and when it comes into play, and in fact, who are the dual agents, if anybody. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this disclosure other than to say dual agency occurs when the listing agent and the buyer's agent come from the same brokerage. They are not dual agents. It is the broker themselves that is the dual agent. So the listing agent represents their client, the buyer agent represents their clients, and the broker, who they share in common, is the dual agent. So the purpose for having this consent for dual agency form in your disclosures that you're going to upload to give access for the buyer's agent is by having this form signed by the seller is giving permission for any buyer's agent within your agency to show that property. Without this form, agents in your office cannot show this property. Other agents can, but agents within your brokerage that share the same broker cannot. So as we go through page 1, I just want to cover what triggers dual agency. So when dual agency may occur, 1, the buyer is interested in a property listed by a real estate broker, and 2, the seller's agent and the buyer's agent are affiliated with the same real estate broker, like we covered. So they have a choice here. If they consent in writing to dual agency, which is this form, then we all become intracompany agents. If they refuse to consent to dual agency, then one party or the other must terminate their brokerage relationship with the broker. Okay, now we're going to cover what the duties of a dual agent and intracompany agents are, and then we're going to go over the mechanics of how it actually works with who signs what and then affirms at what time, but don't worry about that yet. Duties of a dual agent and intracompany agent. Like other agents, unless the client gives consent to disclose the information, dual agents and intracompany agents must keep confidential information about a client's bargaining position or motivations. For example, without written consent of the client, a dual agent or intracompany agent may not disclose to the other party or other party's agent, 1, anything the client asks to be kept confidential. However, dual agents and intracompany agents must disclose material facts about a property to all parties. Material facts mean a fact that, if known, may change their consideration of that property. 2, that the seller would accept a lower price or other terms. 3, that the buyer would accept a higher price or other terms. 4, the reasons why a party wants to sell or buy, or that the party needs to sell or buy quickly. Or 5, anything that relates to the negotiating strategy of a party. Now this is interesting because this assumes that agents are sharing all kinds of information with each other, but it's only the broker that's the dual agent. Let's say it's someone else in your office down the hall. You're not going to go sit there and talk about your client's information with them because it's confidential anyway. So you're going to go about it just as if it was a normal transaction. However, it's just within the same brokerage is all. So what happens is if you go down to the bottom, you'll see that the seller has to originally give consent on that first signature line. That signature line just says basically that you can have other agents within your office show that property. That's all that that's giving you permission for. Once you actually have a buyer from your office, whether it's with another agent or whoever, that actually wants to write an offer and is interested in that property, then they are actually going to sign where it says affirmation of prior consent to dual agency. They're going to sign right there in that middle spot, and that's the buyer saying that they give consent to dual agency. And then the seller is once again, even though they gave permission before to have buyer's agents from the same brokerage show the property, at the very bottom they're affirming that decision and once again giving permission to actually participate in an actual contract with a buyer from an agent from the same brokerage. Clear as mud? Moving along to inclusions, exclusions, and utilities addendum to exclusive right to sell residential broker agreement, also known as inclusions, exclusions. This particular addendum to the listing agreement is important because this is where the seller is going to fill out what all systems and things are included in the sale and what is not included in the sale, so that there's no mistakes or misunderstandings when a buyer walks through the property and they think that, say, certain lights or fixtures are included when the seller has no intention to include it. This just clears that up, and it also is a form that we're going to be uploading so that the buyer's agent is going to have access to this, and they directly take what's on this disclosure and transplant it onto one of the pages in the actual contract itself that specifically lists what all is included in the sale and what is excluded. Also on this disclosure, the utilities, what type of utilities, etc., will be on here. That's also useful when you're inputting this property into the MLS system. You can refer back to this disclosure and see what all types of systems are included. Now, when you go through this disclosure, make sure you're actually asking them these questions and having them fill it out correctly. I don't want to go through all of these, but I am going to go to one of them that's very common to be misunderstood. Go down in the first row where it says cooktop. A cooktop is a stove that is just out there on a flat surface with, say, a range hood over it. Oftentimes you may find these on certain islands, and they'll either have a range hood over it or it's self-contained and it actually sucks the exhaust down into it. They're very expensive. But a cooktop is different than, say, a range, which you'll find on here, a range or a stove. That is not the same as a cooktop, but you'll see those interchangeable in here sometimes, but they're not necessarily the same thing. All right, now moving on to the electronic signatures addendum. This here simply is going to allow you to use electronic signatures in your transaction, and that is becoming the norm. Now, this also says, though, that even though the parties agree to use electronic signatures and that it's binding, it says that if a third party, such as a lender, title company, hazard insurance, etc., requires the use of handwritten or what's commonly called wet signatures, that both parties mutually agree to re-execute all of these with wet signatures. Also, in the line there on the last paragraph, you're going to put which service you use. We use .loop. A lot of companies use DocuSign, etc. So just put whatever you're going to use in there, and then both parties sign and date. Nice and simple. All right. Now we're getting into the good stuff. Notice of buyer's rights and seller's obligations. It is very important that you know this one, that you know when it applies, who it applies to, and what situations it doesn't apply to, and that you can explain that with some fluidity with your sellers without having to read every word of it. Now make sure you understand this particular disclosure, because this issue here has the potential to get you in some doo-doo as well as your sellers. This one is so important that we're going to read this one verbatim. Note: this notice does not apply to 1. The initial sale of a single-family residential property which has never been occupied, or for which a certificate of occupancy has been issued within 1 year prior to the date of the contract. 2. a transfer that is exempt from the transfer tax under subsection 13-207 of the tax property article, except land installments contracts of sale under subsection 13-207A11 of the tax property article, and options to purchase real property under subsection 13-207A12 of the tax property article, or 3, a sale by a lender or an affiliate or subsidiary of a lender that acquired the real property by foreclosure or deed in lieu of foreclosure. 4, a sheriff sale, tax sale, or sale by foreclosure, partition, or by court-appointed trustee. 5, a transfer by a fiduciary in the course of the administration of a decedent's estate, guardianship, conservatorship, or trust. 6, a transfer of single-family residential real property to be converted by the buyer into a use other than residential use or to be demolished. Or 7, a sale of unimproved real property. So basically, those things, what they all had in common there, the exemptions, were that they had no real way of knowing for sure what the condition was of that property because they hadn't lived there or wouldn't have a reason to know it. Other than that, you're on the hook. All right, moving along. Section 10-702 of the Real Property Article of the Annotated Code of Maryland, Section 10-702, requires that a seller of a single-family residential property, the property in quotes, deliver to each buyer on or before entering into a contract of sale on a form published and prepared by the Maryland Real Estate Commission either A, a written property condition disclosure statement listing all defects including latent defects, latent means hidden, or information of which the seller has actual knowledge in relation to the following. 1. Water and sewer systems, including the source of household water, water treatment systems, and sprinkler systems. 2. Insulation. 3. Structural systems, including the roof, walls, floors, foundation, and any basement. 4. Plumbing, electrical, heating, and air conditioning systems. 5. Infestation of wood-destroying insects. 6. Land use matters. 7. Hazardous or regulated materials including asbestos, lead-based paint, radon, underground storage tanks, and licensed landfills. 8. Any other material defects including latent defects of which the seller has actual knowledge. 9. Whether the smoke detectors will provide an alarm in the event of a power outage, and 10. If the property relies on the combustion of fossil fuel for heat, ventilation, hot water, or clothes dryer operation, whether a carbon monoxide alarm is installed on the property. Latent defects under Section 10-702 means material defects in real property or an improvement to real property that 1. A buyer would not reasonably be expected to ascertain or observe by a careful visual inspection, and 2. Would pose a threat to the health or safety of the buyer or an occupant of the property, including a tenant or invitee of the buyer. Or B. A written disclaimer statement providing that 1. Except for latent defects of which the seller has actual knowledge, the seller makes no representations or warranties as to the condition of the real property or any improvements of the real property, and 2. The buyer will be receiving the property as is with all defects, including latent defects that may exist except as otherwise provided in the contract of sale of the property. Section B continued. Don't forget to have the sellers, while you're on your appointment, initial at the bottom of page 1. Oftentimes people forget that. Moving along. At the time of the disclosure or disclaimer statement is delivered to you, the buyer, you are required to date and sign a written acknowledgement of receipt on the disclosure or disclaimer statement, which shall be included in or attached to the contract of sale. Section 10-702 further provides that a buyer who receives the disclosure or disclaimer statement on or before entering into a contract of sale does not have the right to rescind the contract based upon the information contained in the disclosure or disclaimer statement. Now you know why we upload these and provide these immediately. You are hereby notified that in certain circumstances you have the right to rescind your contract with the seller if the seller fails to deliver to you the written property condition disclosure or disclaimer statement. Section 10-702 provides that a buyer who does not receive the disclosure or disclaimer statement on or before entering into the contract has the unconditional right, upon written notice to the seller or seller's agent, 1. To rescind the contract at any time before the receipt of the disclosure or disclaimer statement, or within 5 days following receipt of the disclosure or disclaimer statement, and 2. To the immediate return of any deposits made on account of the contract. Your right to rescind the contract under Section 10-702 terminates if not exercised before making a written application to a lender for a mortgage loan. If the lender discloses in writing at or before the time of application is made that the right to rescind terminates on submission of the application or within 5 days following receipt of a written disclosure from a lender who has received your application for a mortgage loan, if the lender's disclosure states that your right to rescind terminates at the end of that 5-day period. Did you catch all that? Your rights as a buyer under Section 10-702 may not be waived in the contract, and any attempted waiver is void. Your rights as the buyer to terminate the contract under Section 10-702 are waived conclusively if not exercised before 1. Closing or occupancy by you, whichever occurs first, in the event of a sale, or 2. Occupancy in the event of a lease with option to purchase. So their rights to terminate are void once they move in. The information contained in the property condition disclosure statement is the representation of the seller and not the representation of the real estate broker or salesperson, if any. However, that does not get you out of disclosing anything that was obvious to you. A disclosure by the seller is not a substitute for an inspection by an independent professional home inspection company. You should consider obtaining such an inspection. The information contained in a disclosure statement by the seller is not a warranty by the seller as to the condition of the property, of which condition the seller has no actual knowledge, or other condition including latent defects of which the seller has no actual knowledge. The seller is not required to undertake or provide an independent investigation or inspection of the property in order to make the disclosures required by Section 10-702. The seller is not liable for an error, inaccuracy, or omission in the disclosure statement if the error, inaccuracy, or omission was based upon information that was not within the actual knowledge of the seller or was provided to the seller by a third party as specified in Section 10-702, 1 or 1. You may wish to obtain professional advice about the property or obtain an inspection of the property. Okay, that was a lot of mumbo jumbo there, but you gotta pay attention to it because this is the stuff that can, other than deposits, it's one of the more common areas where agents get themselves into trouble. So make sure that disclosure, that things are disclosed. Also, this advice of buyer's rights and seller's obligations is what is going to lead into the next thing we're going to cover, which is the actual disclosure or disclaimer statement. Now make sure this one here that your sellers sign this and that you sign this when you take the listing, and we're going to upload these, and that automatically takes care of your obligation to disclose so that they cannot rescind within 5 days, etc., because you've disclosed it up front before they've actually even written the contract. Moving along. I know that can be brutal, and I hope I'm not losing you, so let's dive right into the Maryland Residential Property Disclosure and Disclaimer Statement. Woohoo! Stay with me. What the hell? What the hell is this crap? Oh yeah, you like that? Boom. You guys are a bunch of freaking real estate assassins. Just like this guy's assassin of the 80s. I believe they call it getting rickrolled. What? Man, that red hair is crazy. Desert you. What? Let's do some real estate. All right, we're back. Hope we shook out the cobwebs there real quick. Now we're going to start right in on this awesome disclosure form right here, the Maryland Residential Property Disclosure and Disclaimer. However, what's interesting, this is actually a 4-page disclosure disclaimer, and the reason I keep saying disclosure disclaimer is because the first 3 pages are the disclosure, where we're disclosing the property condition. The last page is the disclaimer. You're only going to do one or the other. Either you fill out the first 3 pages and you're going to disclose the property condition, or they will not fill out the first 3 and they will only sign page 4, which is the disclaimer, saying it's being sold as is with no warranties, but they will list any material defects. So, with that being said, let's jump right into this. On page 1, they're reiterating basically what we just went over on the last disclosure that we went through, the buyer's rights and seller's obligations. Again, learn these exemptions, and if you can deliver them without reading them, you will sound like a boss in your listing appointments. So, these exemptions, let's cover this real quick. The following are specifically excluded from the provisions of 10-702. 1. The initial sale of single-family residential real estate, A, that has never been occupied, or B, for which a certificate of occupancy has been issued within 1 year before the seller and buyer enter into a contract of sale. 2. A transfer that is exempt from the transfer tax under 13-207 of the tax property article, except land installment contracts of sales under 13-207A 11 of the tax property article, and options to purchase real property under 13-702A 12 of the tax property article. 3. A sale by a lender or affiliate or subsidiary of a lender that acquired the real property by foreclosure or deed in lieu of foreclosure. 4. A share of sale, tax sale, or sale by foreclosure, partition, or by court-appointed trustee. 5. A transfer by a fiduciary in the course of the administration of a decedent's estate, guardianship, conservatorship, or trust. 6. A transfer of single-family residential real property to be converted by the buyer into use other than residential use or to be demolished. Or 7. A sale of unimproved real property. Memorize those, be able to deliver those nice and simple, and you will sound great. Okay, now, at the bottom here, if you do elect to fill out the disclosure, just like in the inclusions, exclusions, we're going to go through the systems of the property: water supplies at public well, other, sewage disposal, garbage disposal, dishwasher, heating, air conditioning, hot water. Now, page 2 is where we really start getting into the meat of this questionnaire. I want to go over a couple things real quick before we get into, say, some of the specifics in here. One is they'll give you questions like foundation, for example. 1, any settlement or other problems, yes, no, unknown. Make sure on all of these questions that a box gets checked, either yes, no, unknown, or does not apply. Do not leave them blank. Also, I have seen agents before ask these questions of their sellers and fill this in themselves, meaning the agent actually was checking the boxes for them. Please do not do that, because if there is something wrong with the property, let's say the buyer moves in and they discover a defect that should have been known and they're somehow able to prove that the seller knew about it, the first thing they do when they start suing people, including the agent, they're going to go to this disclosure form and pull it out. And guess what? If your handwriting is all over it as to you're the one that filled it out, that's a whole lot of exposure and liability right there. So please turn this form around, have them read it, and have them actually check the boxes themselves. One other note on that topic: if you like to have all of these pages signed electronically after your appointment, I would advise you to at least take this disclosure with you and have them fill it out by hand at the appointment and then just take it with you. So rather than reading through this entire form, it's pretty self-explanatory, and that's good because that means you can give it to them and they can read it, and it's pretty self-explanatory as they're filling it out also. They may have a question here or there as to if something applies or not, and just answer the question using common sense and your best judgment. And again, page 3, it's all pretty self-explanatory stuff. If they have any questions, simply you can read this, answer it, etc. And one of the most common questionable things is, let's say one of these things was an issue, but it's been repaired and signed off on. My advice on that is read the question and it'll tell you, is it asking for a current situation, or for example number 13, would destroying insects any infestation and or prior damage? That's specifically asking if there's prior, even if it was repaired. So just read the question specifically and then answer as it actually applies. All right, and now we're at page 4 of this document. Remember I was saying before, they either fill out the first 3 pages disclosing the condition of the property, or they leave those blank and just sign page 4, which is what this is. This is a disclaimer statement here, and this basically just says, except for the latent defects listed below, which they must list, the undersigned owner of the real property makes no representations or warranties as to the condition of the real property or any improvements thereon, and the purchaser will be receiving the real property as is, with all defects, including latent defects, which may exist, except as otherwise provided in the real estate contract of sale. The owners acknowledge having carefully examined the statement and further acknowledge that they have been informed of their rights and obligations under 10-702 of the Maryland Real Property article. And then they would list the actual knowledge of latent defects. Just because they fill out this form doesn't mean they don't have to list the defects that they're obligated to list, which is why it gives them space to do so. Now, there's a trade-off here if you provide the disclosure or the disclaimer. When the disclosure is provided, it usually makes buyers and their agent feel a little bit more comfortable with the condition. When the disclaimer is provided, which is perfectly legal, it sometimes will leave a question in the minds of the agent on the other side, who may relay that over to the buyers. So just keep that in mind, that there is a little bit of trade-off. It's a little less filling out, and maybe they feel it might be a little less exposure, but it also causes a degree of uncertainty in the eyes of the buyer and their agent. So just something to keep in mind. Finally, we are on the county and local disclosures. In this case here, I'm using a Frederick County general disclosure and right to farm ordinance. Each county, whether it's Montgomery County, however, that's a whole different animal, and that's going to be in part 4 because there's so much to it. Carroll County, Annapolis, Baltimore County, etc. Every county has their own disclosure, so just make sure to, whatever county you're taking the listing in, that you have the appropriate county's disclosure, or if there's a municipality, sometimes they'll have a disclosure as well, such as Rockville, Tacoma Park, Frederick, etc. So just include that as well. And in this case here, we're not going to go through everything that's in this Frederick County general disclosure. I wanted to really include it as an example. Say legal requirement, there will be something there, usually equal housing, master plan, zoning ordinances, condominium association approval, things like that. Say Baltimore County, it's got say the airport and various other things that they may experience. And then if we go to page 2, you're going to see right to farm ordinance. And I always thought that was kind of funny. The agricultural operations, it says they may experience certain sights, sounds, and smells that are related to agriculture, and that they have a right to do so. That's always a funny one. So anyway, you can briefly just summarize some of those as you're presenting them, and then just move forward from there. Make sure, of course, that they initial at the bottom of each one of your county disclosures. And also sometimes with the municipal disclosures, you'll also see that there's a certain time period that they have to go view any sort of master plan or growth plan or something like that, and there's a that period. But usually you'll see also they can either sign that, acknowledging, or they can sign a waiver of that 5-day period. And usually, most of the time, I have them sign the waiver of it, so we move things forward. But that's up to you, just something to look out for. So just to recap, we covered consent for dual agency, inclusions, exclusions, electronic signatures, buyer's rights and seller's obligations, property condition disclosure and disclaimer, and the county local disclosures. Now those are the ones that are going to go in every core package that you're going to upload into the MLS. In the next session, we're going to cover circumstantial ones that may or may not apply. So you may use them, you may not. We're going to cover why that is, such as lead-based paint if the property was constructed in 1978, or let's say a short sale or something like that, that the circumstance dictates that you need extra disclosures as part of your package that you upload. Again, thank you once again for joining us in this training session. This is Tim Brooks with the Brooks Group and the Ultimate Selling Team at Keller Williams Realty, and I'm wishing you all the success and look forward to seeing you in Part 3.